Alexander Gerber, thank you very much for taking the time for this interview. You're coordinator of the Nucleus project, a 4-year project investigating how responsible research and innovation could be better taken up in universities and research institutions, research organizations. What are the most important findings of the Nucleus project?
Well, let me maybe give you 3 points. The first one is it's not something you deliver, it's not something that you just do, it's not a checkbox that you tick. We call it's a process in context. It's a learning process for an organization to go through. Second point would be, some people assume this is maybe a governance issue. You need to have policy incentives and disincentives and regulations and career mechanisms and so on, so like a top-down mechanism. And others are arguing that isn't this about culture change, and then this distinction between scientific culture and science culture and risk culture from an innovation point of view. So shouldn't we see this more as a bottom-up movement, like have to change it down at the level with every PhD student and even every graduate student? So I think Nucleus has shown it is definitely both. And the third point, if I may, there are these 4 dimensions of RRI, which we in the project have seen need to be addressed, all of them. So the first one would be, do you really anticipate the implications of the work you do, or the research you do, or the innovations you're preparing and presenting? The second would be, do you fully and sufficiently include the stakeholders? Do you include them upstream and not at the point when, at the sales point of a product to be sold? Third point, do you reflect? And fourth point, respond to those stakeholders' needs, expectations, anxieties, hopes, concerns. Only if those 4 points, to some extent in a sequential order, are addressed, is when either an individual or an institution or a whole country, if you want, arrives at what we could call RI.
Do you see any kind of regional differences or disciplinary differences in the take-up of this concept?
In a country like China, where you have a different cultural background and different policies in place, it's somehow taken for granted that you put the public interest at the heart of the research and innovation endeavor, because basically that's what you as a publicly funded researcher are there for. Compare that to a country like Germany, where we have the freedom of research in the constitution, and you can as a researcher always say, don't touch my project. A country like South Africa, where you think, are they kind of more adapting towards what happens in the US and in the EU? Well, South Africa has a national science engagement strategy. You have very different degrees of maturity, perceptions of the problem, expectations from the policy side, the degree of diffusion of those concepts into the research communities, also different understandings of business, of course, in different parts of the world. And that's what made Nucleus, I think, for many of the, or most, if not all, the participants so fascinating, that you could show that diversity in those approaches and that there could be a mutual learning between those without trying to come up with the off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all solution.
What do you see as the main differences between responsible research and responsible innovation?
Putting public purpose at the heart of the research and innovation enterprise is something that should be almost obvious and to be taken for granted for a publicly funded institution. You're funded by the taxpayers' money, so you deliver to societal challenges. For a private enterprise, there needs to be an economic value. Loads of examples, like, technically it's not a bad idea to have e-scooters in inner cities, unless you're blind and you start stumbling over them. Maybe this is something we haven't really thought about, that we need regulations of where to park them. If we were to address that early on, and if we had told industry like, hey, we would like sustainable, safe, regulated e-scooters, they would say, wonderful, let's make a, pardon my French, shitload of money out of that and produce millions of e-scooters in that way. We haven't told them. So the mistake, I think, is not that industry isn't delivering the innovation we need, it's that the system as such, the research innovation, also the policy system as such, has failed to address those needs, analyze them, anticipate them early on in order to say, hey, this is what we do need.
Is there a direct way as well from citizens to businesses without the regulation in between?
Well, companies have been doing that for a long time, focus groups and market analyses and so on. Again, if we think about it more systemically, about the whole country, about the whole European Union, then you need at some point a regulatory element to drive a whole industry or a business sector into certain directions. It's a complex, let's say, negotiation process on a societal level where we as a society, as the European Union, as citizens, we need to negotiate amongst each other which futures we want to buy in when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence, when it comes to how they deal with our privacy, when it comes to climate change and which energy sources and energy consumption and so on. So all of these things need to be negotiated. Is that going to happen in hundreds and thousands of focus groups across the continent? Probably not.
Are there any specific characteristics of the business sector we have to be aware of? And how can we create a level playing field where industry, research, citizens, civil society organizations interact and co-create?
If we think of a concept such as social license to operate, this is, in the meantime, a fundamental business requirement and an awareness across all business sectors that if you don't have a social license to operate, then you don't even have to acquire for the legal license, so to speak, to bring your products to the market. Freeman spoke of shared values. That's already, I think, a good concept to show that these things have to be considered in combination. And it's not profit against sustainability or profit against responsibility in the case of RRI. But ideally, the interest in responsibility is driven by an awareness of, hey, this actually pays off.
With the upcoming Horizon Europe program, the successor of the Horizon 2020 program, the Commission suggests to embed responsible research and innovation into each individual project. That's quite ambitious. On the other hand, the RRI unit has been dismantled, the SWAFS program will not be prolonged, and the second and the third pillar, the Key Enabling Technology pillar and the Grand Societal Challenge pillar, will be merged. How can we organize Horizon Europe in a way that citizens play a key role in this new program?
Now the European Commission, the policy units need to define these missions, for example, when they need to write the actual work program. This is a very practical process, and that is where we need to infuse the reflexivity that if you define a mission, you take into account that you already think about ethical implications, legal implications, societal implications. Then what about those people writing those proposals? How would they know which aspects, when we talk about RRI, to address in their proposals? If those proposals then include good examples and good concepts as to how to integrate RRI in water management and nanotechnology, whatever projects, then how can we ensure that this is appropriately assessed and evaluated? And how do you do an impact assessment in the end that whatever they promised as societal engagement, stakeholder engagement, and anticipatory governance of their technologies, whatever they're developing there, has actually taken place and has had the effect that they had promised and that we would expect, or they would have expected as funders. So it's on all levels. You need to write down what criteria are. You need to tell proposal writers. You need to tell applicants and reviewers and the evaluators in the end. So this is to some extent actually not a political issue. It's an almost technocratic exercise.
Isn't there a certain risk that also in Horizon Europe, responsible innovation and responsible research innovation becomes a tick box exercise?
So you need to operationalize it, and the Commission is very much aware of that. But there are more players, of course. There are the mission boards, which are quite strong, and so we need to engage and convince the chairs and the members of those mission boards. We need to bring parliamentarians on board, that they see it's not necessarily just about leading edge technology, but we want to, again, do all of that in the context of we're responding to societal needs and grand challenges. It is a massive challenge at the moment. I think there's a lot of awareness here in Brussels that this is what needs to happen. And there's also a willingness and availability of the community, the social science and humanities community, to support these now policy measures. It is at the same time a huge risk to give up something that has worked to quite some extent, and now experiment with mainstreaming that across 90 billion euros of research funding, basically. What do we mean if we want to have an RRI element at the heart of every research and innovation and exercise funded by the European Commission? What does that mean? Very concretely, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean I have a festival event or an exhibition? Or no, it's not about dissemination. It's not about classic approaches of science communication. We really mean that there should be elements of social science and humanities built integrally into the project.
At what level do we need more capacities or different governance mechanisms? At the level of the whole program? At the level of the individual project?
Since we talk about the regulated system of publicly funded research, that you can actually change these things quite easily by modifying the assessment criteria and the funding criteria, which in industry wouldn't work. If an entrepreneur doesn't like a certain framing, then they go for different markets. They just change the product line. They said, no, I'm not going to do that. Yeah? In research, the research community follows the policies of funders to some extent. In that case, it's a lever for systemic change in how research and innovation is being conducted on this continent.
What is the recent state of the art in science communication, and what are the grand challenges ahead?
The institutional science communication, which is by far the most dominant voice out there, is driven by institutional agendas. And that is to quite some extent comparable to marketing and even advertisement in the commercial sector, in the private sector. You could argue there's nothing wrong with it, but the policymakers are expecting more. Society is expecting more. So there's so much more that science communication could do to mediate and to negotiate and to be the interface between those different players in the research and innovation system, to make sure that researchers address the grand challenges in the way that they should be addressed. What's important to understand is that this is very much, if not entirely, driven by the policy framework and the environment in which we work and live. So we have a certain commercialization of the higher education system, which automatically leads to a more marketing-oriented, self-promotional, institutional, branding-oriented form of communication. What you see is certain monitoring activities, which then report back to the funder, like the European Commission, for example. We've done so many events, and the website has so many clicks, and we have 345 followers on Twitter. The pure numbers themselves don't mean much. They are informing us in terms of monitoring what's going on. But how do we, in the end, connect behavioral, attitudinal change from a theory of change perspective in terms of outcomes to the original objectives of the project?
Today we're facing grand societal challenges like climate change, like aging society, like digital transformation, and all of these are called the wicked problems because there are no simple linear solutions. How can we engage with the public with such complex challenges, and how can we engage with citizens without losing the experts at the same time?
2 points. Implications of the research being done and the innovation being pursued. These implications need to be anticipated. They need to be discussed before the experiments take place, because before the prototypes are being produced. So that's a totally different understanding of it. And secondly, understanding the needs, the expectations, the hopes, the anxieties works in research and innovation just like in any other relationship. You shut up and listen. So that's a different form of communication. That is not the same as the motives and the raison d'être of science communication in many institutions as we see today. So in order to transform the understanding as to why are we actually engaging is much more important than the question of how do we engage them. So that's where we have to start. Is the scholarly publishing system, whether it's open access or closed access, actually helpful in what it is that we're trying to do with RRI? If you want a more responsible research and innovation system, you've got to change the system.
It's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.